Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Matthew Carey Jordan with the Mary Mother of the Good Shepherd Institute, and I am delighted today to be joined by a colleague and friend, Father Patrick Manning of St. Mary's Seminary and Graduate School of Theology. Father Manning is a native of Youngstown, Ohio, and a historian of the church, her traditions, and the major events over the last 2,000 years. Father Manning, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone that's taken the time to listen to us and spend a little time with them. I'm deeply grateful for that. That's very
As am I. Thank you for saying that. Sure. And today we're going to talk about a figure who I know both of us admire, but you know far more about than I, and that is a recently sainted English Catholic, St. John Henry Newman. Father, could you start off by telling us a little bit simply about who St. John Henry Newman is and why he's a significant figure in the Catholic Church?
Well, certainly, obviously, he's a cardinal, but in fact, he was a convert to the faith. I would put him with St. Thomas Aquinas, and I would put him with Augustine in terms of the doctor, which of course means teacher of the church. He lived a very long life in mid-Victorian England, and he came through a very interesting conversion. He became a Christian early on, but he was an evangelical. But he embraced the Anglican tradition and became an Anglican priest. Very, very bright. He studied at Oxford, became a don at Oxford, and eventually he became an Anglican priest, and he was the priest at St. Mary the Virgin in the center of Oxford. And interestingly enough, it's very, very well documented that they gave him his classes at odd times because the students would flock to his classes when he was teaching, and the other professors would get very jealous. But he was always interested in finding about the roots of the Christian tradition. And he was very, very interested in the early church, especially the fathers. He was a classicist. He spoke, he wrote in Greek and he wrote in Latin. And he spent a lot of time studying the early church, especially people like Ignatius of Antioch, St. Polycarp. And to the point where he became very interested, especially in the Arian heresy. And the Arian heresy, interestingly enough, was what it caused him, after a little bit of a journey, to become a Catholic. He started to ask himself, well, wait a minute, now maybe I'm in the wrong church, following precisely what the early fathers were teaching in their letters.
Because, of course, he would have been an Anglican in this mid-19th century in England.
Very much, and of course, a very, very bright Anglican, because obviously we already know as a student and then a professor and then obviously the chaplain of the university, his pedigree was incredible. And he was very well respected among the students, and he was well respected among the faculty as well. But he started thinking in ways that others hadn't been thinking before, and he started to study what are called the 39 Articles. Now, the 39 Articles are articles to which one had to ascribe if one wanted to be an Anglican. And if you decided at that time that you were going to become a Catholic, and you had been at Oxford or Cambridge or any of the great universities, if you converted to Catholicism from the Anglican tradition, your name was completely erased from the books of the great universities, as if you'd never existed, as if you'd never been there. He took that chance, and in fact, that happened to him. Eventually, he was a bit reconciled with the university, but he had such a profound impact on the university that he caused a lot of other professors to leave and become Catholic. He started what's called the Tractarian movement, and then eventually the Oxford movement. One flows from the other. But all of this is indicative of his enthusiasm for Catholicism and Catholicism's traditions, including the papacy. And he suffered quite a bit because of the chances that he took. He suffered, interestingly enough, at the hands of the English, but he also suffered at the hands of the Irish bishops. I'd be glad to speak of that in just a moment. And he also suffered at the hands of the Catholic hierarchy in England. Unfortunately, just to give you an example of the kinds of things that he had to deal with, after he became a Catholic, reflecting, and you know as well as I do that there's something very special about those who have an intellectual conversion. He wasn't a flighty, emotional type of person. He kind of thought his way and reasoned his way into the Catholic Church, which is one of the reasons why I so admire him. Now, any way that the Holy Spirit calls people into the church is just absolutely wonderful. But the fact that he reasoned his way by studying and by thinking, and he called into question the 39 articles and said, one of these, a couple of these articles sound just like Roman Catholicism. Well, he got himself in big trouble for that. So he ended up writing, I mentioned the Tractarian movement. The tracts were these letters, if you will, newsletters that would be passed out all around, calling for the reform of the English church. This is how it started out. The English church was very much run by the government. And of course, as you know, the monarchy is still, at least in theory, the head of the English church. Yeah. And he and a number of other very, very bright professors were very, very concerned about how the church was being influenced by the government and that this shouldn't happen. He makes a couple of references in particular to one professor, one minister who actually was really Orthodox according to the Anglican tradition, but the congregation didn't like him because of what he was teaching, even though it was Orthodox, and they got the government to have him removed from his pulpit. And of course, Newman thought this was absolutely crazy, that the government was removing an Orthodox Anglican pastor from his parish. So there was a number of reasons why he and his colleagues wanted to right the English church, if you will, and get the power back to the church and back to the ministers and away from the government. So they started this Tractarian movement. They wrote these tracts, and with a lot of other very, very bright professors from Oxford, they passed them all throughout the areas of the great universities, carrying them by horse, so that people would start a groundswell movement, grassroots movement, if you will, to change the church. And more people became interested in this. And,
which, if I can interject, my understanding of the Tractarian movement was that they didn't initially see themselves as breaking with the Anglican Church and moving toward Rome. Right? They saw themselves as reforming the Anglican tradition, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. And Newman exactly was right in the middle of it. Yes, he and a number of his colleagues were very concerned. As a matter of fact, Newman wrote a book called the Via Media, and he was, in fact,
meaning
right. Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah, it means in the middle of the way, the middle road.
Because the Anglicans have often long thought of themselves as a middle way between the Protestant reformers and the Roman Catholics, right?
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. And so his book, the Via Media, written, of course, when he was an Anglican, argued that the true faith, the true Christian faith, was the Anglican faith, and it was the middle way, the Orthodox way, the proper way between the excesses of evangelicalism on one hand and Roman Catholicism on the other. And so he and his colleagues were very much interested in reforming the Anglican Church, had no thought at all of becoming Catholic. And his Via Media, actually, his work is very, very anti-Catholic. And later in his life, of course, he recanted from what he'd said. So this certainly didn't start out as a movement toward Roman Catholicism at all.
It has a lot of resonance for me personally as a convert, because I know when I was coming from American evangelicalism into the Catholic Church, I had for a while expected that I was going to wind up Anglican myself, partly because I'm a lifelong lover of C.S. Lewis, and of course Lewis was an Anglican, and it just I didn't get very far down the road before it became clear to me that if I entered the Anglican communion, that was only going to be a stop on my way to Rome, and so I didn't see any reason to make that detour myself. You were saying that he ran into trouble then with the English Catholic bishops. I would have thought, and here we're getting into a gap in my own knowledge of Newman's story, I would have thought that when you have a public intellectual like him, a very prominent thinker at Oxford, really kind of the intellectual heart of Anglicanism in a lot of ways, that the Catholic bishops would be falling over themselves with joy and praising this guy, and it sounds like that isn't what happened for him.
No, it's not what happened for him, and you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you mentioned this because you've just brought into the whole dynamic what is important is historical context. And what's important to remember is that it wasn't until 1830 that the Catholics in England were allowed to have bishops. Before that, because of all the 300 years of oppression, but in fact, a lot of people were surprised. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on an Englishman with all my relatives on both sides are all Irish. And of course, the Irish, suffered quite a bit. And so the question that you ask is a really good question about the Catholic bishops, because again, as I mentioned, the English government really gave him a tough time, and so did the Catholic bishops. I'll do the Catholic bishops first in answer to your question. At the same time, it's important to remember that the Catholics, once they were allowed to have their faith back, once they were allowed to have their church back, once they were allowed now to open up seminaries again, it was important to remember that Catholics were refused an education. As a matter of fact, when I was a deacon in Scotland, the pastor there had gone to the seminary in France because there was a long tradition, because Catholics weren't allowed to have seminaries in England, that they had went to seminaries in France and Spain. So anyway, so the Catholics start to get their roots again, and they start to be able to have schools and have education. And there was this historical context is important. There was a group called the Ultramontanes. The Ultramontanes, it comes from two Latin words, ultra, which means over, and montane, meaning mountain. And basically, it's an ideological piece where the idea is almost like a Catholic fundamentalism, if you will. If you need an answer to anything Catholic, you look over the mountains, that is, you look over the Alps, and you look into the Vatican. And of course, this was not part of Newman's life at all.
Of course, yeah.
Not part of his tradition. And he believed that a lot of these issues should be dealt with on a more local basis, and that not everything had to go to the Vatican. He was very much a believer in the papacy, very much a believer in papal infallibility. But he was persecuted in some sense, and I don't think the word's too strong. He was persecuted by these more conservative ultramontane bishops who were leery about his conversion and leery about his thoughts about the Catholic Church, not really understanding it and not being brought up. One of the issues, too, and again, historical context is important here, it's important to remember that he didn't have the philosophical background that the Catholic clergy had. As you know well, being an administrator here in the seminary, the whole idea of getting a strong philosophical background, especially in classic philosophy, even back to Aristotle and Plato, was all very, very important. And all Catholic priests have had that. Well, he read the ancients and he understood them, but he wasn't really trained in the way that all the other clergy were trained. And so when he became a Catholic, he was kind of an outlier, if you will. And so he was looked upon with suspicion with a lot of the things that he would suggest. One of the things, and I think eventually, hopefully you and I will get to this, one of the things that really caused him to be under suspicion by the Catholic hierarchy was his intensive and intentional defense of the laity. The laity are so very, very important to him, and that certainly wasn't on the agenda in Roman Catholicism anywhere, especially in mid-Victorian England.
Yeah, I think anyone who knows a little bit of the history of the church will not be surprised to hear that. I mean, that very much a clerically oriented understanding of how the church is to live out its life. Fair?
No, sure, fair enough. And as a matter of fact, there's many students of Newman would know this. He was in a discussion with a number of other Catholics not long after he'd become a Catholic, and among them was a Monsignor Talbot. I can't remember his first name, but Monsignor Talbot. And they were discussing the laity, and Monsignor Talbot said, "The laity, well, their job is to hunt and to shoot and to fish. Why would we defending the laity?" And Newman said, "Well, you'll have to admit the church would look awful foolish without them."
That's very good. Why don't we actually turn to that question? I realize we may circle back to St. Newman's biography, but what you've what you've raised is, in fact, one of the main things that I was also hoping to have a chance to discuss in this conversation. And that is not just the laity per se, but more broadly, I've heard it said that that John Henry Newman was one of the most influential thinkers of his generation, and really that his influence on the 20th century, at least the Catholic world in the 20th century, cannot be overstated. And particularly when it comes to thinking through Vatican II.
Absolutely.
So that's a fair statement in your view.
Absolutely.
And then I wonder if you could help unpack that. I think for listeners or viewers who know a little bit about Vatican II, they may already be connecting some of the dots. But for those who aren't really sure, could you say a bit about how Newman in the mid-19th century gets us, 120 years later, to the documents and the conclusions of the Second Vatican Council?
Matt, I'm really glad that you brought up, you mentioned the 20th century, and then you mentioned the Second Vatican Council. And you're spot on, because Newman became a Catholic about 20 years before the Vatican I, but had no influence in Vatican I at all. It was very, very much a papally centered council, but it had profound impact on the 20th century, and especially on the Second Vatican Council. And even after, interestingly enough, after the Second Vatican Council in 1983, there was a new code of canon law that was promulgated by the church. And one of the interesting things about the canon law in the church is that for the first time, canon law insisted on the rights of the laity, and especially the rights of the laity to access to the sacraments. So again, the laity, but this...
so 1983 is the first time the church makes an explicit statement in canon law about the rights of the laity?
About the rights. I mean,
that's extraordinary.
The people, the explicit... Now, the idea, of course, is the sacraments are for the church and for the people. So, the code of 1917 certainly had those, but the emphasis on the rights of that certainly is something new. People obviously had certain rights because they were baptized and members of the church, but this idea of the importance of the laity. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but not only for Vatican II, but later on, carrying into 1983 in the Code of Canon Law, there's this importance of the laity. And this is where it all starts. It all starts, I mentioned this Oxford movement and the Tractarian movement. And there's a lot of people, brilliant professors who left Oxford and became Catholic. Now, the problem was at that time, most of them were Anglican priests. They weren't allowed to be Catholic priests at that time because they were married. And one of the first things Newman did was he encouraged a number of them to start a Catholic periodical. It's called The Rambler. And I at first, when in this very building, when I was researching the Rambler, I saw it downstairs and I thought it was Samuel Johnson's Rambler. But no, actually it was this periodical that began in 1848, and it ran to about 1862. So it's about 14 years. But the Rambler was run by lay people, and it was the whole point behind it was to help Catholics be educated. That was that was his bread and butter. He said the Catholics have to, and there's a wonderful theological reason behind that I'd like to get to. But first of all, because of the very dignity of humans, and that they've been deprived of an education, deprived of the university for so long, especially the great universities. That, and of course, we know the same thing happened here in the United States. In places like Harvard and Yale, they wouldn't let Catholics in. So the Catholics are far behind. So he wants them to be educated. One of the best ways to do it is to have a Catholic periodical. Now, he warned these Anglicans, because he himself could get in trouble, don't write on theology. Write on things like art and architecture and other things like that. And they didn't always listen to him. But the whole point is that he wanted these converts, first of all, to have a job. He wanted them to have their families that have something to eat. It was that simple, because they lost absolutely everything, as did Newman when he left. But at the same time, the education of the laity was so important to him. He knew that how far behind they were from the Englishmen that they were living with, and a lot of them were working for. But here's probably the most important point, and I'd like to mention this is important for every person that's listening that's baptized. This is something that Newman pulled together theologically that is so very, very important. And so if you're baptized, I would invite you to listen to what Newman has to say. Newman was convinced that it was very, very important to listen to the laity and to educate the laity because they're baptized. And because they're baptized, and the Greek word that he uses is phronema, and it means kind of like an instinct or a possession. And every baptized person is in possession of or has an instinct about the Holy Spirit. That comes with the great gift of baptism. And so they have to be taken seriously because they indeed are baptized and they're gifted and they're children of God. And so as part of this rambler, Newman, and eventually there's a whole lot of circumstances that I won't go into, but eventually he ended up becoming the editor to save it because it was going to be shut down by the Roman Catholic bishops in England. And in it, he wrote an article. The background is very interesting, but it's a bit too much to go into here. But he ended up writing an article. It was entitled, On Consulting the Laity in Matters of Doctrine. Now, this is 1859.
So this is a completely unheard of.
Completely
that title must have really...
Consulting the laity? Are you kidding me? They're the laity. Their job is to hunt and to shoot. And he insisted that it's very important. Now, one of the reasons he got in trouble with is because the word consult in English didn't help him much, because a lot of the higher ups, the administration of the church, thought it meant the Protestant model of everybody deciding as a group, much as they do in Protestant churches, which is, a good thing for them. But he didn't mean consult in terms of sitting down and everybody giving their opinion and having a vote as an American democracy. But he meant, to get a sense of. So the analog that he uses, go and look at a thermometer. You consult the thermometer or consult the barometer. So you see what's going on. And so the laity, and this is going to be very, very important because actually Pius IX, a lot of people don't know this, Pius IX did this very thing. He consulted the laity about the belief in the Immaculate Conception before it was promulgated in 1859. And he did it through the bishops, so he didn't really do it in the more modern model of God rest his soul, Francis, and his whole idea of synodality. But it's so very important because what he's saying is this, is that I like to call it, and this is a big description of a very simple idea. I call it a theological, epistemological principle of disproportion. Don't be scared about that, but what it really means is this. It means this, is that Newman says the mind can know an idea. It can know an idea, but it can only perceive it in parts. So if I had 30 people in this room, and I'd say, okay, close your eyes. I'm going to give you a word, and I want you to put a picture in your mind. Okay? So these 30 people, they close their eyes, and I say, okay, now here's the word Jesus. I give them a moment to look at it, and then I say, okay, now what image came to your mind? And I might get 30 different images. And guess what? They're all right. They're all right. And so the point is that the more you consult, the closer you're going to be able to approximate the whole. Okay? And that's really very, very important. If you want to know what's going on among the people of God, you need to listen to what they're saying. But here's the other side that a lot of people don't think of, and that is this: to the extent that you don't take the laity seriously, to that extent you're dismissing the Holy Spirit. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. And of course, he came under attack for this sort of thing as well when I was talking about suffering at the hands of the church, because this is such a revolutionary idea. It's such an unheard of idea at this time.
Yeah.
But he was very serious about taking baptism seriously and taking every baptized person seriously and their faith experience personally.
So then how does that get worked out in, how would you connect those dots from Newman, the individual theologian, to Vatican II, the Ecumenical Council?
Exactly. That's a very good question. And the idea is that this is the first time somebody's kind of put a pin in the balloon, in the balloon, and said, wait a minute, there's something inside here. And we have to see that once you see, you can never not see. And once you see that, in fact, he has something to say, and there's really no argument against it. The Holy Spirit works in every one of our lives in many, many ways, and often because we're individuals, it works in unique ways. But we all have something, to be colloquial, to bring to the party. We all have something gifted by the Holy Spirit. And so I'm going to learn something as a priest. Let me give you an example. My mother, God rest her soul, wonderful woman of deep faith. My mother later ended up having cancer. And she was a nurse, and after she retired, she became a pastoral minister. And she went on into the hospitals and the various wards as a pastoral minister. And she would go to the cancer ward, and she'd sit down and talk to these people, and they'd say, I have cancer. And she said, well, I have cancer too. Now, she's got some gifts that I don't have. Nothing against me, but that's not a gift that I have to be able to, not that cancer is a gift, mind you, but to be able to relate. And in particular, like some mothers and, of course, whole families, they've gone through this terrible, terrible, terrible experience of losing a child. Well, my mother lost a child, so she would go on to the maternity ward, and there'd be a woman and nobody would be visiting her. And, well, what happened was that she had complications. She lost her child, but people didn't know what to say. So she would go in and sit down and say, I lost a child, and cry with her. Somebody like me going in and doing something like that, as well as my intentions might have been.
It's just very, very different.
It's very different and almost vacuous compared to somebody. So I think this is the kind of fruit that started to emerge when Newman said, we need to start taking the laity seriously.
It's so interesting because I think for anyone who's a 21st century Catholic, I mean, it's almost feels commonsensical, right? That, well, of course the laity are supposed to do this stuff, right? And this is, I mean, part of why we created this Mary Mother of the Good Shepherd Institute is to, with a particular focus on lay people and helping folks cultivate a fuller, richer Catholic intellect, a Catholic mind for the sake of the ministry of the church, to do the work of the church. But that, it's fair to say, I take it, right? This is a pretty novel thing.
It's a very novel thing. Could you imagine? You imagine a priest in 1850 or 1860, getting the people together and saying, what do you think? Well, that never happened. It didn't happen much in 1950, excuse me.
Is it fair to say, whenever we talk about what would have happened, we're in purely speculative waters, right? And we don't know what God would have done and what might have happened had things been different. But hypothetically, given the way things did unfold, fair to say that the Catholicism of 2025, as we're recording this video, would be substantially different had John Henry Newman never existed?
Absolutely, because Vatican II would have been substantially different if John Henry Newman hadn't existed. And again, it wasn't any type of huge movement like a tidal wave that came, but other people, the resourceful theologians reading him and getting ideas about Nouvelle Theology, some new thoughts. Which are,
of course, sort of the two buzzwords of Vatican II, right?
Sure. And of course, a lot of these theologians, not all of them, a lot of them were priests, but a lot of them were also lay people who were thinking some of these things out. And that wouldn't have been heard of before this happened. The church was, and again, this isn't a criticism, it's just the fact that the church was very, very clerical at the time. And it just kind of developed that way. There's probably a lot of reasons in history that we could go into. But that it's important for us to realize how revolutionary Newman was. I can give you another example of how revolutionary he was if and when we talk about the development of doctrine.
I was going to ask you about that. Although I wonder if before we get into the development of doctrine, and maybe I'm wrong maybe my intuitions aren't lining up with the reality here, but your comment about the way in which Newman's understanding of baptism and its significance speak to his understanding of the importance of the laity. Is that also connected to Newman on the individual conscience? Because I know that that's an area where Newman's had a significant impact, and I'd be curious to hear you unpack that a bit. So
that's a wonderful bridge that you just built, and in fact, they are very much connected, not necessarily in his work exactly back and forth, but they're very much connected. Here, as you remember, earlier on, I mentioned that he was persecuted by the church, but he was also persecuted by the government.
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. That's right. We sort of dropped the thread of his biography somewhere in that ballpark. So please, let's pick it back up.
Sure. And the main dynamic in terms of being persecuted by the government, I would call it persecuted because he was laid waste and tried to be publicly embarrassed by William Erhard Gladstone, who for the longest time, back and forth, and a couple of times, was the Prime Minister of England. And Newman had such an influence that now he has the Prime Minister of England challenging him and talking about him in the public media, especially a magazine called Macmillan's Magazine. And to boil it down to the essentials, Gladstone, the Prime Minister, said, trying to tell all Catholics and trying to tell especially all English people that it's impossible for Newman to be a good Englishman because he won't listen to what the English want him to do. He'll do what the Pope wants him to do. He's one of those papists. He's one of those Catholics. Now, I'm old enough, and good for you, you're not, to remember the hubbub that went on at the time John F. Kennedy.
I wondered if that's where you were going to go. I've heard about this. Please say more.
Absolutely. I remember hearing it. I was 8, 9 years old, when Kennedy was running, and there was talk all over the place about you can't elect Kennedy. He's a Catholic. He'll do what the Pope says. He'll set America aside, and it was very real. And the same thing happens with Gladstone. So anyway, he really ridiculed in public, and so he writes this interesting letter, and it deals with conscience. And in this letter, he appeals to the Duke of Norfolk, who is probably the only Catholic that has any kind of position in the English hierarchy. And he's kind of always been Catholic. So he writes this letter to kind of defend himself to the Catholic Duke of Norfolk to repute what Gladstone's saying. But the title is interesting. The title is A Letter Addressed to His Excellency, the Duke of Norfolk, upon Mr. Gladstone's recent expostulation.
They had the best titles in the 19th century.
Absolutely. And this letter...
It's not clickbait. That doesn't work on TikTok, but it's a great title.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's you don't text that. Yeah. And upon Mr. Gladstone's recent expostulation, what a word. But basically what he does is that it's interesting. He takes on this idea and he says something that, again, is incredibly revolutionary. And what he argues that that's absolutely not true for a whole lot of reasons. But what's most important is in the 4th chapter. By the way, this letter is about 70 pages, maybe 80 pages. But in the 4th chapter, he deals with conscience. And what he says is that... interestingly enough, that Catholics have to answer ultimately to their conscience. Now notice, he didn't say that Catholics have to answer ultimately to the Pope or to the Church, but to their conscience. Now, of course, the assumption is, and this is the topic of moral theologians, it's not simply that you answer to your conscience, but that your conscience has to be well-formed. Okay, but having assumed that everybody knows that, there's no use appealing to your conscience if your conscience isn't well formed. So basically what he's saying is that, I don't have to do what the church says. I have to listen seriously to what the church says. And if I'm not going to do what the church says, I'm going to have to answer to the Lord on the last day because it's his body. It's the body of Christ. He said, but ultimately I have to answer to my conscience. And he calls conscience the aboriginal vicar of Christ.
That's a great phrase. What on earth does that mean?
Yeah, the aboriginal is that at the very root, at the very bottom, at the very source, that like an aborigine is just untouched by modern society. The way it was intended from the beginning is that the conscience is the voice of God, and to go against your conscience, even if you're wrong and you don't know that you're wrong, even if you're wrong. It's wrong to go against your conscience. And so he ends that chapter with saying, and so to the Holy Father I toast, but to conscience first. which is great. Now, there's something that's revolutionary. Again, another reason why the ultramontanes, those who were always looking over the mountain, weren't all that animated. Along with that is that with this term of, all of this is going on at the time of the First Vatican Council and the issue of papal infallibility. And Newman was a firm believer in papal infallibility. And what he meant by that, and I think it's really, I'm just going to take a little turn here so that people understand what we mean by papal infallibility. Of course, it's misused and misunderstood more by those who are not of our tradition than Catholics. But the idea of papal infallibility is that Newman says, if God had given us a revelation, which he has in Jesus Christ, if God in his goodness would give us a revelation, he would have never done so without providing an organ to keep us from fault theologically. And so that the Holy Spirit is always going to be with the church, and the church is never going to go off the rails on dogma or morals. And so that's what it really means. But here's the kind of political thing that got himself in trouble with the people in who were always looking to Rome. And he was saying that, we finally, as Catholics, started to get some of our rights back. We started to get some of our dignity back. We started to get some land back. We started to get our identity back. Okay, and I'm a firm believer in infallibility, but his opponents wanted to use it as a political tool. In other words, okay, now the head of your church is the monarch. The head of our church is the Pope. And he's infallible. Nah. I mean, that's right. It's almost this.
Our head's better than your head.
Yeah, exactly. Let's not go down that road. We're making our way back. We're making progress. I'm a firm believer in infallibility, but now's not the time we should proclaim it. It's a bad decision to do that. It's the wrong motive for doing it. So it's not that he was against infallibility. But again, that's part of the political dynamic that's going on that he's dealing with. It's very complex.
So it sounds like for political reasons as well as for theological ones, that this evaluation of conscience or articulating the role of the conscience in the individual believer's life really was an important counterpoint to the development of the doctrine of papal infallibility. Fair way to put it?
It is, in that the idea of proclaiming infallibility at that time was more political, and not a wise choice. It was more of a political move than any kind of theological move. There wasn't no particular need to do it at that particular time, save trying to defend ourselves.
Interesting. Well, I'd love to spend a little bit more time on that, but I think it would probably be in our interest to keep moving along a bit. And
sure.
I just myself used a phrase unwittingly. That's the next thing that I was wanting to ask you about. And the last big topic that I was hoping we'd have a chance to cover, that's the development of doctrine. I can say for myself as a convert that perhaps the single most important book that I read over I don't know how many years it took me to get from being open to Catholicism to actually coming into the church. But during that season of life, I at some point came across a book by John Henry Cardinal Newman called An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. And looking back, that may have been the single most important thing for me as a Protestant Christian to read, to make the Catholic paradigm more compelling and to draw me into the fullness of the faith in the Catholic Church. So with that sort of personal preamble, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what did Newman mean by the development of doctrine, and why is it important?
Sure. It's a very, 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 very good question. And what I think is so interesting is that the idea of development and change as we go along. Of course, as you know, one of the things that he wrote, one of the lines that I use all the time is, to live is to change, and to live well has to have changed often. And of course, change isn't necessarily, but it's part of life. The only constant about life is change itself. But anyway, the development of doctrine is very, very interesting because development means changing, and things are going to be growing. What is interesting is that he wrote the essay on the development of doctrine. it came out of one of his tracts. It might have been tract 90 that I mentioned before. He started to write about this in one of his sermons a lot earlier, back in the 1830s. And this idea itself was developing within his own thinking. So then he started to write this class or this sermon trying to address this idea of development of doctrine. And by the time that he finished it, and it's interesting you should say that's what caused you to really think this thing through, is that when he finished it in 1845, it caused him. It caused him to do the very same thing when he finished what he wrote on development.
So this
of
is prior to his conversion that he's.
It's prior to his conversion. It's what caused his
I must
conversion.
have known that at some point, but I'd completely forgotten. I thought that was the Catholic Newman writing that book.
No. It's very much Protestant. Where he got to the point where, when he was finishing it, he said, "I've got to step back from the Anglican tradition."
Wow.
Anyway, the development of doctrine is really interesting, because he said, now, and it's this so fundamental question for Christianity. Let me show you the problem by going back to in the early church. Now, there was a heresy that I believe it's the Montanists. And the Montanists, it was Montanist and two female colleagues who had this revelation that their revelations were more powerful and more important than the revelations given to the apostles. Well, here's the problem. If their revelations take over, well, who's the next one to come along and say, my revelations are going to take over? And the next one comes along and says, well, my revelations took over. And so basically the Catholic Church teaches that revelation in itself stopped with the death of the last apostle. But our understanding of it and our unveiling it and coming to a deeper understanding of it. Again, this goes back to this epistemological piece about the mind. You know St. Thomas Aquinas, but you don't have present in your mind right now everything St. Thomas Aquinas said. And Shakespeare, but you don't have everything Shakespeare wrote. And so you read more Shakespeare, you get a better idea because it develops. Now, so everything we need to know is there, but because of the limited capacity of the human mind, we can only know it as we move along. And so when as we move along, we get more insight. So the issue was, and you still find this, especially among biblical fundamentalists, they charge Catholics with not being good Christians because we ascribe to things that are not in the Bible,
or at least not explicitly in the Scriptures, right?
Yeah. Well, even the ones that are implicit are pretty good, but the ones that they find difficult are things like purgatory, or the papacy, or cardinals, or things like that. But again, if you go back and you look at nature, and Jesus used this all the time. You look at nature, you have a seed. Okay, now within that seed, is the beautiful plant that eventually is going to show up. It's the same thing, which is why we're defending of life from the very beginning, from conception, because everything is there, but it takes time, and it's the very same thing. And so the Holy Spirit being with the church allows the church to can understand. And so this was his answer. He knew he had to answer, why does the Catholic Church have things in it that weren't in it in the early church? Because the early church was the apostolic church, and there's a lot of different traditions through the years that have tried to imitate. A good example, and you know this because you live very close to them, the Amish. They try to go back and they try to make, understandably, their church look like the early church, where they gather in people's homes, which is what happened in the early church. But the idea is that just like an onion that we can peel, just like a book that we learn more, the idea is that the Holy Spirit allows us to come to a deeper understanding of what the Lord is trying to teach us.
Well, and I think that metaphor, the analogy of an organism, is a really powerful one, right? I mean, and again, I speak as a convert, and I think of both the experience that I had at one point, but then also a challenge that Protestant friends through the years have continued to raise, where they say, and this is to say something you just said a minute ago in slightly different words, like people look at the contemporary Catholic Church, and then they look at, say, the book of Acts in the Bible that lays out the earliest days of the Christian movement, of the existence of the church, and they say, I see this and I see this, and these do not look the same. I just don't see how you get from here to there. But then, like, look at an acorn and look at an oak tree. Like, you would never guess from an acorn that you could get something like an oak tree, and yet you can. And you do, and everything you need for the oak tree is in there. It just has to be nurtured in the right kind of soil. That is the analogy, right?
Sure, it is. It is the analogy, and of course, in terms of things developing understanding, I remember many, many years ago, my mother said, "I will never ever use a microwave." She went through two or three microwaves. We learned something new.
Tough to live in the modern world without a microwave.
But interesting, I mentioned earlier the heresies. Now, what's so interesting, going back to what you just mentioned, that organic image, interestingly enough, if you get a bee bite on your ankle, okay, now what is your body going to do?
React. I'm going to get some kind of physical.
Right. It's going to say, this doesn't belong here.
Yeah.
Okay. In the church, we call that heresy. That the church has a built-in integrity so that with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, when something comes up, and you see these heresies all throughout the early church, the one that's probably the longest and the most important is the Arian heresy. But a good, healthy body rejects things that don't belong there. And that's why we have these heresies in the early church, because it doesn't say anywhere in the New Testament that Jesus is fully human and fully divine.
Yeah, this again for me coming into the church, that particular issue was a big one, because I started to recognize that, well, wait a minute. When I'm reading the Bible, when I read the New Testament, I do find like some of these texts, it's not obvious, certainly to a casual reader of these texts, or even a fairly sophisticated one. I mean, Jesus prays to the Father, right? And you don't get a statement of the doctrine of the Trinity that's anywhere close to what I was always taught, which is the canonical statement that the triune God exists eternally as one substance and three persons, right? But that language isn't biblical language. That's a later understanding of the biblical witness, but with such strong with such force behind it that even for me as a Protestant, I'm like, well, this is no longer up for grabs.
Right.
This isn't something that I, as an individual, can say, oh, actually, I think the churches have been wrong about the Trinity. But what I started to realize is, I already believe in the development of doctrine. I just need to be persuaded that the church is, in fact, the authority that God has given us in order to help recognize what's the difference between an authentic development of doctrine versus what Newman called a corruption.
Right. And in his essay, he has, the marks of a corruption. He has, these are the things we need to watch out for as a body develops. So yeah, it's genius. The other thing I think is very important is this idea of developing. Okay. I don't want to say that it's incredibly innovative, but he established this development of doctrine and his understanding of it in 1845. Okay, it wasn't until 1859 that Charles Darwin wrote on the
interesting connection, on the origin of species.
On the origin of the species, exactly. And so he's 15 years ahead of Darwin in terms of how things change and things evolve, and that's just a natural way that things happen.
Fascinating. Okay, well, so we've got to, as we sort of draw this particular conversation to a close, I mean, we've identified three big ideas in Newman. We have the importance of the laity in the church and moving through or past or beyond a more clerical kind of Catholicism. We've talked about the role of the conscience as the aboriginal vicar of Christ, and the idea of the development of doctrine. I know that there's other things that Newman wrote about that have also been influential. Really quickly, are there other things that would leap to your mind as like, but here's the other stuff for the aspiring Newman fan? Right.
Well, first of all, in terms of spirituality, his prayers are they're magnificent. His prayers are magnificent. His sermons and his lectures are just absolutely, for example, one of the things that I would suggest that would be really very, very helpful, and in the past, in many liberal arts colleges, it was a mandatory reading, but the idea of a university, which
yes.
is his public lectures. He was asked in the year 1850 by the Irish bishops to come to Dublin and establish an Irish university because there hadn't been one.
We didn't even get to that whole part of his story. We're going to have to do this again sometime, I think.
Yeah, and then at the other piece, and you can read his. He wrote a play called Gerontius, obviously dealing with an old man.
Of course,
gerontology, and an old man looking back on his life. Probably the one that I think made a profound impression on me. It's not easy reading, but it's really good stuff. Is An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent.
I was wondering if you're going to point to that one.
Yeah. I remember I was a graduate student. As a doctoral student, I read just the first page, and I thought, I have no idea what he's saying. But
it's a pretty sophisticated work of philosophy, right?
Very significant.
What he's talking about there, as I understand it, and I will confess this has been on my books I need to read list for a long time, though I've sort of picked up the flavor of it. I believe this is where he gives us the phrase that probability is the guide of life.
Right. Exactly.
And he talks about, this is such an interesting and important question about how is it that we come to change our beliefs? The grammar of assent, right? So it's ASSENT, like the grammar of coming to agree or to give our assent to something. Fascinating question and topic.
Absolutely. So he doesn't, he doesn't prove doesn't prove faith, but you can give an assent in faith because it's probable. I was thinking about this today in prayer, actually. I don't know why, but I was thinking, looking around, I was looking at the sky, and it's a beautiful sunny day, of course, which is very precious here in Northeast Ohio, and I thought, there's really no other answer. I mean, there's just no other answer that God sent Jesus and he's risen from the dead and that we're going to be with him forever and ever and ever and ever. And of course, I got caught up in that mind-blowing thought of thinking about ever and ever and ever, but it's the importance of giving assent to the faith that it's almost like trusting.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I think you can probably drop the word almost, right? It is a form of trusting.
Yeah, it's a form of trusting. Yeah.
Newman, if I'm not mistaken, was a poet as well.
Oh yeah, he was.
I guess it's sort of alluded to, and you mentioned that he was writing plays, his sermons. I mentioned earlier being a fan of C.S. Lewis, who I think anyone who's encountered Lewis knows that Lewis really is one of the masters of English prose. But I know that Lewis himself looked to Newman as one of the great examples of someone who simply, on purely aesthetic grounds, was one of the great writers in the history of the English language.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, and I know that we're just about out of time, but as a matter of fact, I have a little book on my shelf, and it's a completely secular book, absolutely completely secular book. But it has the greatest writers of the 19th century. And in that group is Newman. Simply because if you want to learn how to write,
this is someone to
that's
pay
who to
attention
read.
To. Yeah.
Are
there, in that vein, if folks are listening to this conversation and are interested in themselves learning about Newman, so he's a brilliant writer, though he's he has a much more sophisticated vocabulary and sentence structure than most of us are probably super comfortable with in 2025. Are there any particular texts by Newman himself or by any of his biographers or their resources? What would you encourage somebody to look at if they're interested in Newman?
Good. And I do hope that some of who've been patient enough to listen to us would be interested to learn more. There are two things that I would suggest that they do. First of all, get a small biography. The classic work is just called Newman by Ian Carr, and it's kind of a big tome, and it's really very, very well done. But I would begin with two things. I would begin with one, a smaller book. I know there's one by Brian Martin and another by Cardinal Avery Dulles. Avery Dulles was a huge fan of Cardinal Newman. I would begin with somebody reading his biography, and then this is a piece that we hadn't talked about that I think is absolutely essential. Then do yourself a favor and read his autobiography called Apologia Pro Vita Sua. Now, apologia, the Latin, doesn't mean an apology. It means like an explication or like a defense, or this is why I became what I did. And he wrote it right after he became Catholic. So he finished it about halfway through his life. So the really the second half of his life isn't included in there, but it is a wonderful exposition of the thinking that went into his conversion.
It's a wonderful book. I would second that recommendation. In fact, I almost brought it up, so maybe this is a fitting place to wrap things up. But when we were talking earlier about that tension between individual conscience and the infallibility of the magisterium and submission to authority as a Catholic, one of the lines that absolutely blew me out of the water in my conversion process was reading in Newman's Apologia. There's a point in there where the main character, because he writes it, as I recall, it is an autobiography, but it's an allegory as well, isn't it? Or does he write in the first person? Is it a straightforward autobiography?
Yeah, it's pretty much.
Okay, then maybe I was confusing it with Bunyan, but I'm sure this is from Newman, because Bunyan would never have said this. He was talking about the Eucharist, right, and belief in transubstantiation and the real presence. And at some point, someone who's skeptical of his conversion says, "Can you really believe that?" And Newman's response was, "I can believe it if I must." Right? That is, I can submit my own intellect, my own conscience to this authority if it is in fact the true authority that God has given us.
Right. And just to add, you're absolutely right. And I would add to that list my will. I submit my will to. And to trust that, God is operating in the world and in particular through the church, and that we need to trust. Just one last thought, for example, one of the things that is not in the Bible, but the church teaches is purgatory. I ran across a colleague of mine, and he said, "Well, I don't believe in purgatory." And my response is, "You better hope there's a purgatory, because if not, you're either in or out."
That's
and of
right.
course, basically what it is, it's the development of our understanding of God's mercy, that, God's a merciful God.
Yes. I mean, this is probably a conversation for another time. You can point to some of St. Paul's language about some being saved, but as through fire, or something like that. I forget the exact phrase in one of his letters to the Corinthians, but
right, exactly. Yeah, there is. And I just looked it up about a week ago when I was looking up purgatory, and there was that one passage, and I don't know if it's in Corinthians or Galatians, but there is that one passage that makes a reference that you can kind of eke out.
Yeah, there's at least hints there, but definitely a conversation for another time. For now, let me say so much thank you, Father Manning, for taking this time to have this conversation. To anybody who's listening, we hope you've enjoyed it. We hope that this will inspire you to look more into the life and works of St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, and that you want to explore more about the Catholic intellectual tradition. We hope you'll check out our stuff online through Mary Mother of the Good Shepherd Institute. You can follow us on social media at MMGSICLE or www.dioceseofcleveland.org/MMGSI. Thanks so much, everybody.